August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. The Enola Gay, a B-29 Superfortress bomber, released a single atomic bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated 1,900 feet above the city. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. A blinding flash of light was followed by a massive fireball and shockwave. The temperature at ground zero reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Buildings within a 1-mile radius were instantly vaporized. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people died within minutes. By the end of 1945, the death toll reached approximately 140,000 due to burns, radiation sickness, and injuries. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people immediately and 80,000 by year's end. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, ending World War II. The atomic bomb was developed by the Manhattan Project, a secret U.S. government program that began in 1942. The project's initial purpose was to build the bomb before Nazi Germany did. Albert Einstein and other physicists had warned President Franklin D. Roosevelt that German scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, were working on atomic weapons. The fear was that Hitler would acquire the bomb first and use it to win the war. The Manhattan Project was a race against Germany, yet the bomb was never used on Germany. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, before the bomb was ready. The first successful test of an atomic device occurred on July 16, 1945, in New Mexico, over 2 months after Germany's surrender. By the time the bomb was operational, the only remaining enemy was Japan.
This raises a question that historians, ethicists, and the public have debated for decades. If the bomb had been ready before Germany surrendered, would the United States have used it on a German city? Or were there factors, strategic, political, and racial, that made Japan the target? This analysis examines the development of the atomic bomb, the timeline of its availability, the decision-making process, and the role of race in determining where and against whom the weapon was used. The Manhattan Project began because of Germany, not Japan. In 1939, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved nuclear fission, splitting uranium atoms and releasing massive energy. The discovery had obvious military implications. If controlled fission could be achieved in a bomb, it would be the most powerful weapon ever created. Jewish physicists who had fled Nazi Germany, including Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Eugene Wigner, understood the danger. They knew that Germany had the scientific expertise and resources to develop an atomic bomb. Werner Heisenberg, one of the world's leading physicists, was working in Germany. The Nazis controlled uranium mines in Czechoslovakia. German scientists were conducting nuclear research. In August 1939, Einstein signed a letter to President Roosevelt, warning that Germany might be developing atomic weapons. The letter, drafted by Szilard, stated, "It may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed." The letter urged the United States to begin its own atomic research immediately. Roosevelt authorized funding for nuclear research. Initially, progress was slow. The project expanded significantly after the U.S. entered World War II in December 1941. In 1942, the Manhattan Project was officially created under the U.S.
Army Corps of Engineers. General Leslie Groves was appointed to lead the project. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist, was named scientific director. The project's objective was clear: build an atomic bomb before Germany did. The fear was not that Germany would use the bomb defensively, but offensively. If Hitler had the bomb, he could destroy London, Moscow, or any city that resisted. The Allies would be forced to surrender or face annihilation. The Manhattan Project was framed as a defensive necessity, a race to prevent a Nazi atomic bomb. The project was massive. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed over 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, equivalent to over $30 billion today. Facilities were built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, uranium enrichment, Hanford, Washington, plutonium production, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, bomb design and assembly. The work was conducted in absolute secrecy. Workers did not know what they were building. Security was so tight that Vice President Harry Truman was not informed about the project until he became president after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. By 1945, the Manhattan Project was nearing completion. Scientists had designed two types of bombs, a uranium-based bomb, Little Boy, and a plutonium-based bomb, Fat Man. The uranium bomb was simpler in design and did not require testing. The plutonium bomb used an implosion mechanism and needed to be tested to ensure it would work. The test, codenamed Trinity, was scheduled for July 1945 in the New Mexico desert. But by mid-1945, Germany was no longer a threat. The war in Europe was over. The bomb designed to stop Hitler would never be used against him. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The surrender followed Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th and the fall of Berlin to Soviet forces. The European theater of World War II was over. The threat that had motivated the creation of the atomic bomb no longer existed.
At the time of Germany's surrender, the atomic bomb was not ready. The Trinity test had not yet occurred. Scientists were still assembling the plutonium bomb and refining the uranium bomb. Even if the bomb had been ready, logistical challenges would have made its use against Germany difficult. The atomic bomb required a specific delivery method. The bombs were large and heavy. Little Boy weighed 9,700 pounds. Fat Man weighed 10,800 pounds. Only the B-29 Superfortress bomber could carry them. The B-29 had the range, payload capacity, and pressurized cabin needed for high-altitude bombing missions. However, B-29s operated in the Pacific theater, not Europe. The European theater used B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, neither of which could carry the atomic bomb. Deploying B-29s to Europe would have required significant logistical preparation. Air bases capable of supporting the heavy bombers, fuel supplies, maintenance facilities, and trained crews. By early 1945, Allied forces were advancing rapidly into Germany. There was no perceived need to introduce a new weapon. Conventional bombing and ground offensives were succeeding. Additionally, Germany's surrender was anticipated. By April 1945, it was clear Germany could not continue fighting. The Soviets were in Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The German military was collapsing. There was no strategic reason to rush the development of the atomic bomb for use in Europe. Some Manhattan Project scientists and military planners had considered Germany as a potential target. A target committee was formed in 1945 to identify suitable cities for atomic bombing. The committee's criteria included significant military or industrial value, a large urban area to demonstrate the bomb's destructive power, and minimal previous damage from conventional bombing to clearly show the bomb's effects. Early discussions included potential targets in Germany, but by May 1945, these discussions were moot.
Germany had surrendered. The target committee shifted its focus entirely to Japan. It is important to note that there is no definitive evidence that the United States intended to use the atomic bomb on Germany if it had been ready before May 1945. Planners discussed Germany as a target, but no final decision was made because the scenario never occurred. However, the fact that Germany was the original reason for the bomb's development raises the question: would it have been used? With Germany out of the war, Japan became the sole remaining enemy. The war in the Pacific was brutal and showed no signs of ending quickly. Japan had refused to surrender despite devastating losses. The U.S. military estimated that invading Japan's home islands would result in massive American casualties. Estimates ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million killed and wounded. The atomic bomb offered an alternative. If the bomb could force Japan to surrender without an invasion, American lives would be saved. This became the primary justification for using the bomb. President Harry Truman, who assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was briefed on the Manhattan Project and the bomb's potential. Truman faced a decision: use the bomb to end the war quickly, or proceed with a conventional invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. The Target Committee met in May 1945 to identify Japanese cities for atomic bombing. The committee selected 4 potential targets: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Niigata. The criteria were the same as previously considered for Germany: military significance, urban area, minimal previous bomb damage. Hiroshima was chosen as the primary target. It was a major military headquarters, a port for troop embarkation, and had not been heavily bombed. Kokura was the secondary target. Nagasaki was the third option. On July 16, 1945, the Trinity test successfully detonated the plutonium bomb in New Mexico. The test confirmed that the bomb worked. Truman was informed while attending the Potsdam Conference with Allied leaders. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration was issued, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Japan rejected the ultimatum. Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb. On August 6th, Hiroshima was bombed. On August 9th, Nagasaki was bombed after poor weather prevented bombing Kokura. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The decision to use the bomb on Japan was justified publicly as necessary to end the war quickly and save American lives. However, historians have debated whether this was the only or even the primary reason. Alternative explanations include demonstrating U.S. power to the Soviet Union. By August 1945, the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan. Some historians argue the bomb was used to end the war before the Soviets could occupy significant Japanese territory, and to demonstrate American military superiority in the emerging Cold War. Justifying the Manhattan Project's cost. The project had cost $2 billion. Some argue there was political pressure to use the bomb to justify the expenditure. Revenge for Pearl Harbor. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 had killed over 2,400 Americans and remained a source of national anger. Some argue the desire for retribution influenced the decision. These factors are debated, but the official justification remained consistent. The bomb ended the war and saved lives. The question, would the U.S. have used the atomic bomb on Germany, is counterfactual, a hypothetical scenario that did not occur. However, examining available evidence, statements from officials, and strategic considerations provides some insight. Arguments that the bomb would have been used on Germany. The Manhattan Project was created to counter Germany. The entire purpose of the bomb was to prevent Nazi Germany from acquiring it first. If the bomb had been ready before Germany surrendered, there is an argument that it would have been used. Germany was the original target, and the strategic logic, ending the war quickly and saving Allied lives, would have applied. Military necessity. By early 1945, Germany was still fighting fiercely. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944 to January 1945, showed that Germany could still launch major offensives. If the bomb had been ready in early 1945, it might have been used to force Germany's surrender and avoid further Allied casualties. Statements from officials. Some Manhattan Project scientists and military officials assumed the bomb would be used on Germany. There is no record of anyone explicitly saying the bomb would not be used against Germany because they were white Europeans. Arguments that the bomb would not have been used on Germany. Proximity to Allied forces. By early 1945, Allied forces were deep inside Germany. Using the atomic bomb risked killing Allied soldiers, Soviet forces, or liberated populations. Targets in Germany would have been close to friendly forces, making the bomb's use more complicated than in Japan, where targets were geographically isolated. European cultural and racial affinity. Germany was a European nation with cultural, historical, and racial ties to the United States and Britain. Some historians argue that there would have been greater reluctance to use such a devastating weapon on a European population, particularly one that included many civilians of similar ethnic backgrounds to Americans. Political considerations. Germany was occupied by multiple Allied powers, including the Soviet Union. Using the bomb on Germany could have had unpredictable political consequences, particularly regarding Soviet-American relations. The strongest argument that race played a role comes from statements made after the war by some Manhattan Project scientists.
Leo Szilard, one of the physicists who pushed for the bomb's development, later stated that he doubted the bomb would have been used on Germany. He believed there would have been greater moral hesitation to use it on Europeans. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, never explicitly stated that race was a factor, but he expressed regret after the war about the bomb's use on Japan. Some interpret his regret as an acknowledgement that the decision was influenced by the target being Asian rather than European. There is no definitive answer, but the evidence suggests that while the bomb might have been used on Germany under certain circumstances, the decision would have faced greater scrutiny and moral debate than it did with Japan. The question of whether race influenced the decision to use the atomic bomb on Japan is one of the most controversial aspects of the debate. There is no smoking gun, no document where officials explicitly state that the bomb was used on Japan because the Japanese were Asian. However, circumstantial evidence and the racial attitudes of the time suggest race was a factor. During World War II, American propaganda depicted the Japanese in dehumanizing terms. Japanese soldiers and civilians were portrayed as subhuman, vermin, or monsters. Terms like Japs, monkeys, and yellow peril were common in media, military communications, and government publications. This contrasts with how Germans were portrayed, as misled by Hitler or as a corrupted civilization, but still human and European. The dehumanization of the Japanese made it easier to justify extreme measures. If the enemy was seen as fundamentally different and less than human, the moral weight of killing them was reduced. This psychological mechanism has been documented in other conflicts where racial or ethnic differences were exploited to justify violence. Admiral William Leahy, Chief of Staff to Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, opposed using the atomic bomb. After the war, he wrote, "The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. In being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages." Leahy's opposition was based on moral grounds, not racial ones. But his statement reflects that even within the US military, there were dissenters who believed the bomb was unnecessary. Some historians argue that the decision to use the bomb on Japan, but not on Germany, reflects a racial double standard. The argument is that American and British leaders would have been more reluctant to use such a weapon on a European city filled with white civilians than on an Asian city. The cultural and racial similarities between Americans and Germans created a psychological barrier that did not exist with the Japanese. This argument is supported by the fact that firebombing campaigns in Germany, while devastating, was subject to more public and political scrutiny than firebombing campaigns in Japan. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 caused significant controversy and debate. In contrast, the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, which killed over 100,000 people in a single night, received less attention and criticism in the American press and public. However, it is important to note that strategic factors also played a role. Japan's geography made it easier to isolate targets. Japanese cities were made primarily of wood and paper, making them more vulnerable to incendiary bombs. Germany's cities were more heavily constructed with stone and brick. These practical differences influenced bombing strategies. Additionally, by the time the atomic bomb was ready, the war in Europe was over. The question of whether to use it on Germany never arose in a practical sense. The decision was made in the context of ending the war with Japan, not choosing between Germany and Japan. Nevertheless, the racial attitudes of the time cannot be ignored. The dehumanization of the Japanese, the lack of moral outcry over the atomic bombings compared to what might have occurred if a European city had been targeted, and the post-war statements of some officials suggest that race was, at minimum, a contributing factor in making the decision more acceptable. To understand why the atomic bomb was used on Japan, it is necessary to examine the alternative, a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands. The US military planned Operation Downfall, which consisted of two phases: Operation Olympic, invasion of Kyushu in November 1945, and Operation Coronet, invasion of Honshu in March 1946. Military planners estimated that the invasion would result in massive casualties on both sides. The estimates varied, but the most commonly cited figure was 500,000 American casualties, with some estimates exceeding 1 million. Japanese casualties were expected to be in the millions, including civilian deaths from combat, starvation, and disease. These estimates were based on Japan's defense preparations and the experience of previous battles. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown that Japan would fight to the last man. At Iwo Jima, 21,000 Japanese defenders fought to near annihilation. Only 216 were captured, the rest died. American casualties were over 26,000, including 6,800 killed. At Okinawa, Japanese forces and civilians resisted for 82 days. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died, along with 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians. American casualties exceeded 50,000, including 12,000 killed. If this pattern continued on the Japanese mainland, the invasion would be catastrophic. Japan had mobilized its entire population for defense. The government had distributed weapons to civilians and trained them to resist using bamboo spears, grenades, and suicide tactics. Women and children were expected to fight. The concept of gyokusai, honorable death rather than surrender, was deeply ingrained. The US military also anticipated kamikaze attacks on the invasion fleet. Japan had thousands of aircraft reserved for suicide missions. During the Battle of Okinawa, kamikaze attacks had sunk 36 ships and damaged 368 others. The invasion fleet would be even more vulnerable. In this context, the atomic bomb appeared to offer a way to avoid the invasion entirely. If Japan could be shocked into surrender by demonstrating the bomb's power, the horrific casualties of an invasion could be prevented. This was the argument Truman and his advisors used to justify the decision. However, critics have argued that Japan was already on the verge of surrender by August 1945. Japan's military had been decimated. Its navy was destroyed. Its cities were being firebombed. The Soviet Union had entered the war on August 8th, crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria. Some historians argue that Japan would have surrendered within weeks or months without the atomic bomb or an invasion. Supporters of the decision to use the bomb counter that Japan's leadership showed no willingness to surrender unconditionally.
Even after Hiroshima, Japan's military leaders wanted to continue fighting. It took the second bomb on Nagasaki and the emperor's intervention to force surrender. Without the bomb, Japan might have fought on for months, resulting in more deaths from conventional bombing, starvation, and Soviet advances. The debate continues, but the official justification that the bomb saved lives by avoiding an invasion remains the U.S. government's position. After the war, those involved in the decision to use the atomic bomb had varied reactions. Some defended it as necessary. Others expressed regret.
President Truman never publicly expressed regret. In his memoirs and public statements, he maintained that the decision was correct and saved lives. In 1945, he stated, "The atom bomb was no great decision. It was merely another powerful weapon in the arsenal of righteousness." Truman's certainty reflected his belief that the bomb ended the war and prevented an invasion. However, some military leaders disagreed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, opposed using the bomb. He later wrote, "Japan was already defeated, and dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives." Admiral Leahy, as previously mentioned, called the bomb barbarous and unnecessary. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander in the Pacific, reportedly believed Japan would have surrendered without the bomb. J. Robert Oppenheimer experienced profound regret. After witnessing the Trinity test, he famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In the years after the war, Oppenheimer became an advocate for nuclear disarmament and opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb. His regret and activism led to his security clearance being revoked in 1954 during the Red Scare. Many Manhattan Project scientists signed petitions urging that the bomb not be used on Japan without warning, or that it be demonstrated on an uninhabited area first. The Frank Report, written by scientists in June 1945, argued that using the bomb on a city without warning would damage America's moral standing and lead to a nuclear arms race. The report was ignored. In Japan, the bombings are remembered as acts of unprecedented destruction. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are symbols of the horrors of nuclear weapons.
Survivors, known as hibakusha, have spent decades advocating for nuclear disarmament. The bombings are commemorated annually, and the cities host peace museums documenting the devastation. In the United States, public opinion on the bombings has evolved. Immediately after the war, the majority of Americans supported the decision. Over time, as the human cost became clearer and alternative explanations emerged, public opinion became more divided. Polls show that younger Americans are less supportive of the decision than older generations. The debate over whether the atomic bomb should have been used continues. It involves questions of military necessity, morality, the role of race, and the long-term consequences of introducing nuclear weapons into warfare. The atomic bomb was developed to stop Nazi Germany, but was used on Japan. The reason is straightforward. Germany surrendered before the bomb was ready. The first successful test occurred on July 16, 1945, over 2 months after Germany's surrender on May 8th. By the time the bomb was operational, Japan was the only remaining enemy. Whether the bomb would have been used on Germany if it had been ready is unknowable. Arguments can be made both ways. The bomb was created to counter Germany, suggesting it might have been used. However, the proximity of Allied forces in Germany, the cultural and racial affinities between Americans and Germans, and the political complexities of using the bomb in occupied Europe suggest there would have been greater reluctance. Race almost certainly played a role in the decision to use the bomb on Japan. The dehumanization of the Japanese and American propaganda and culture, the lack of moral outcry compared to what might have occurred if a European city had been targeted, and the post-war reflections of some officials all point to racial attitudes influencing the decision. This does not mean race was the only factor, but it was a factor that made the decision easier to justify and accept.
The justification that the bomb saved lives by avoiding an invasion of Japan remains the official US position. The estimated casualties of an invasion were staggering, and the bomb offered an alternative. However, whether the invasion was truly necessary or whether Japan would have surrendered without it is still debated by historians. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. The bombings introduced nuclear weapons into warfare and began the nuclear age. The decision to use the bomb on Japan, but not on Germany, reflects the contingencies of war, the racial attitudes of the time, and the profound moral complexities of using weapons of mass destruction. The question of whether the bomb would have been used on Germany if it had been ready remains unanswered, but asking it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about race, war, and the decisions made in humanity's darkest moments.